Hello there. Welcome to another live hangout here at Voice Essentials. I'm just so glad I didn't introduce it as a vocal analysis because that's what I've been doing the last number of shows. It is so good to see you all again. Thank you for hanging out with us for the next, 40, 50 minutes here at the live show. I hope you've had a good couple of weeks. I have had, I actually had a really good break. My wife and I were able to go away for a few days, and we did so in part, and I want to let you know this because so many of you have been a part of the Voice Essentials family and community for quite some time, long enough to know, to remember when I announced that my wife, and this was 6 years ago, my wife had been diagnosed with colon cancer, and I'm really pleased to be able to let you all know that last week, her oncologist completely discharged her. And that means that she never has to go and see her oncologist again. She doesn't have to do any CT scans or blood tests again. She's been given the full okay and clear. And we're really just so thankful that has been the outcome for Jody, my wife, and for us as a family. And I just a special thank you to you as a community who have shown so much grace and support to us personally over the years around that whole scenario. So I wanted to update you on that because that's pretty special news for us. And it made special because we are very, very cognizant that is not always the outcome for people. And there are all too many times when the outcome is significantly dire comparatively. There you go. We have got a special guest today, a guest that I am so thrilled to have on the show. He is a fellow who I have had the great privilege of knowing for many years. He's been on the show before, Zac Bradford, and you are going to learn so much from this guy. I'm very envious of Zac. Zac, over the years, has traveled the world engaging with the latest and the greatest and the best information with the best people from across the globe. We are going to get to partake with that today, and so we're going to dive straight in. As we're going along, leave your questions. Linda is still in the live chat. Hi, Linda. Linda will be able to take questions in keeping with the conversation that we have. And if time permits, as the conversation rolls along, we might be able to interject your questions as we go along. But without further ado, let me get myself all ready to go here. We should get straight into today's it's an interview. I'm so excited about today's show. Right after this.
Sound check. Check 1, check 2.
Zac, it is so good to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me here. It's great to be back.
No, it is a pleasure to have you back, and we should let people know that you're in the same city as I am, Brisbane, Vegas, as it's locally called, and you live across the river. You're a North Sider, well, I'd like to think it's mutual. We've had the privilege of knowing each other for many years now, way back to. Gee, when was it? Easter Live days? Was it back
Easter
then?
Fest. We did the production of Jesus Christ Superstar, and then we were also you were singing lead, and I was in the gospel choir at the Australian Gospel Music Festival. So yeah, quite some time
dear.
ago.
What an experience that was. We won't go into that. You should have been up front. I should have been in the ensemble. It is so good to have you on the show today, and I want to I want to send my personal congratulations. You are expecting your first child in November.
Yes, yeah, thank you so much. We
It's
are thrilled, and the time is going by pretty fast. So
it's
yeah, we're
so
very
exciting.
excited.
When I learnt of this via Facebook, as we learn of everything these days, of what feels like only a couple of months ago, but it must have been longer because I was a bit surprised to learn it was November that you're due. I was just so thrilled for you and you and Laura, your lovely wife. So it's very exciting. Your world is about to change, my good friend. Your
So
world
I've
is
been
about to
told, yeah,
change. Yes, for the better.
yeah.
It's all wonderful. Kids are awesome. Okay. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to get you onto the show today, besides the fact that I get to just hang out with you, is and I was saying to you before the show started today. I've been very envious of you over the years, the amount of international travel you do and the amount of amazing people that you hang out with when you do this international travel. And we've had a number of those people, Joan Melton, we've got Professor Brian Gill is coming onto the show again in November. And you hang out with him regularly. But you were recently sitting at the feet of Dr. Johann Sundberg, which must have been just an amazing experience. Tell us what you've been doing recently in your travels.
Well, I was very fortunate to be able to go to, I guess, across the globe. It was the US for the Voice Symposium in Philadelphia, and I was there for the week, and that was amazing. I've been there back in 2015, 16, but to spend the week there was fantastic. And then over to Sandvik, Sweden, which was a 4-day intensive summer voice science course at Dr. Johann Sundberg's summer house, and that was phenomenal. And then the SMAC conference, which is the Stockholm Music Acoustics Conference, which happens once every decade, and I believe Dr. Sundberg founded that decades ago. So to be there for that as well was it was awesome. So I came back with my mind blown and notebooks, full of handwritten notes and handouts, and to be honest, I've revisited it briefly, but barely scratched the surface. I've got quite a lot to dive back into and get my head around still. So.
I think when I contacted you, you'd only just got back, because I was Mr. Eager Beaver, and because I thought, we've got to get Zac onto the show to share what he's learned, and your response was, I'm still trying to process it. Can we give me a couple of months to kind of let it all settle down? And what an amazing experience to get to go to the one that Johann founded. That happens only. That's pretty rare to have a conference that happens every decade.
Yeah, it was either started in the 80s or 90s. So there's been 3 or 4 of them, and now Dr. Sten Turnstrom, who holds the same position that Dr. Sundberg held when he was working at the university there. He put it on, and I think that was kind of one of the reasons they put the Science of the Singing Voice course on this year, because it hadn't been done since I think it was 2017 or something like that, pre-COVID. It's done every handful of years. So it was just the stars aligned, and I was very thankful my wife let me go. So, yeah.
Yes, well, with the little one on its way, you might be your wings may be clipped for a period of time, perhaps.
That's a fair call. Fair calls.
No, that's fantastic. When we kind of interacted and started to talk about, well, what are we going to talk about today? Obviously, I want to really hear from you. What have you taken from your recent travels and the learning that you will have taken from it? And you really sort of identified the area of flow, pressure, and resistance, and that I immediately gravitated to that, because it's an area that I talk about in my teaching a lot, probably to the point of boredom for my students, because I'm constantly talking to phonatory threshold pressure and PTF and all these things. Can I give you the opportunity to sort of, jump into talking about the things that you really took away from your time? And I'm thinking particularly of your time in working and doing the intensive with Professor Sundberg.
Sure. I think big ballpark, the things that I took away, these very general things, was one, and I shouldn't have been surprised, but was how generous each of these practitioners, the primary practitioners were Dr. Johan Sundberg, Dr. Brian Gill, he mentioned you've had on, and he's been a mentor of mine for a long time, and Dr. Philip Allard. So they were the three main teachers, practitioners, but how generous and humble, they know so much and have been doing what they've been doing at the highest level, and yet were so humble and just displayed what it is to be a lifelong learner. So I think those things, the curiosity, the kindness, the generosity, that's big ballpark, something I want to emulate and pass on to my students and to those who I get the good fortune to share what I know with. So that was kind of one of the big things that hit me coming back on the plane. With regards to the more technical aspects, I think being able to not only kind of, go to lectures and master classes, but to see these things demonstrated and to be kind of a subject in, the sense that I was able to get up and put on a respiratrace, bands around my ribs and my abs to measure my body movement as I sung different songs in different styles, or to measure my subglottic pressure through a device that does that, and to see people with flow masks on, to see airflow in real time and inverse filtering and all these things that are used for research, but to see them in a really practical, hands-on way where we could play and explore, that to me was one of the most powerful tools to be able to see a lot of these things that you read about and that are really, for me, I still am trying to get my head around these concepts more and more. But that made a big difference to be able to kind of see these things come to life through these tools. So those are probably some of the biggest takeaways. Was just seeing these things in action. But would you like to get into like flow and pressure and resistance and what those things are?
I would. I'm hoping that because you didn't go over there from a starting stop. You are a mature, experienced, singing teacher. You've been doing this for many years, and so I'm just going to be interested in hearing, as we dive into this, what was affirmed and reaffirmed in your own knowledge base, and what was new, what was exciting in the research development. But let's do that, talking, because there are going to be people watching and listening to the show today who are going, flow, resistance, pressure, what's this all about? Maybe we can kick off there and you can help us understand that a bit more.
Fantastic. So probably a good place to start is just a really very brief overview of how vocal sound is made. So when airflow generated by lung pressure sets the vocal folds into vibration, essentially you get an interruption of the transglottal flow, that is the airflow that moves between the vocal folds. As that airflow is interrupted, you get these changes in pressure, increased pressure, decreased pressure, compressions and rarefactions as they're known. And you can think of that as the sound source, or the signal, the sound wave. Essentially, that then travels through your vocal tract, which includes your throat, your mouth, and your nose. And then the sound leaves your body. Listeners hear it, and then they form an opinion on what they think your voice sounds like, which is a whole other can of worms. But essentially, that's it. So you've got the air pressure, which is the driving pressure that causes the vibration. You've got then the resistance at the level of the vocal folds, and there's varying types of resistance we can get into in a bit. And then depending on how much resistance there is, you've got the resultant airflow. So probably a good place to start is the subglottic pressure or subglottal pressure. I use these terms interchangeably. But essentially, when we talk about subglottal pressure, we're talking about the air pressure that builds up below the glottis being the space between the vocal folds. So it's a piece of anatomy that's actually a space, which I find really kind of cool. And the subglottal pressure is largely responsible for vocal loudness, something we want to have great control over, dynamics, right? And it also has, to a smaller effect, an impact on pitch. So let's start with vocal loudness. If you increase subglottic pressure right now, if I'm kind of quieter and I go, to get louder, I increased my subglottal pressure. And if you reverse that, you can get quieter. And to a lesser degree, pitch. And so there's three main things that really impact subglottal pressure. And again, these things I was aware of, but I think to answer your question, this course helped me to clarify in my mind the three systems and to kind of think more clearly, which is really helpful as a teacher to have clarity around these concepts. Sometimes there can be a lot of jargon going through the head, right? So the three kind of main things
we're not short of jargon in our industry, are we?
A lot of jargon, yeah.
A lot of jargon.
And I think for me, I struggle to find clarity with these things, and you know, it's these types of things that we're talking about now are the things as a voice geek that keep me up at night going, but wait a second, if the pressure is, you know. So I've been grappling with these things, as I'm sure you have, for a long time.
Yeah.
But yeah, subglottal pressure is largely influenced by three main forces, that being muscular forces in the body, elastic forces, and gravitational forces. And very quickly, the muscular forces are your muscles of inhalation and exhalation. That is your diaphragm, your internal and external intercostals, the muscles that control rib movement, as well as all of your abdominal muscles. You then have elasticity. So if you take a really deep breath and your body expands, your rib cage expands, diaphragm moves further down into the body, what happens is your lung tissue and your rib cage are moved away from their resting position, particularly after a really deep breath. And then an elastic recoil, at least for a certain portion of the phrase, will be driving the subglottic pressure, unless restrained by muscular forces, the muscles of inhalation, etc. And then, excuse me, and then you have the gravitational forces. So posture is a big thing that plays into this. If you are upright, gravity is going to have an inhalatory effect on the diaphragm, essentially drawing it down towards the ground. Whereas if you're lying in a supine position on your back, gravity is going to have an exhalatory effect on your abdominal muscles, essentially drawing them into the ground and driving increased air pressure. So you can use that to your advantage to help students in working on different things. So that's pressure, and that again then kind of links, if we look at the pitch aspect of that for a second, to the idea of resistance and different types of resistance. Would you like to go into that a bit? Or?
You keep, mate. I'm not interrupting because you're just doing such a fantastic job of explaining this in a really accessible language. So fantastic.
Okay, well, it'll stop me if I'm talking too much.
You know me well enough to say, I'll stop you, but I'm not going to. This is great.
Okay. So resistance, we talked about resistance at the level of the vocal folds. And essentially, when people refer to resistance, they're often referring to the idea of adduction or abduction. Adduction being to think about adding things together or bringing things together, in this case, bringing the vocal folds closer together, or abduction apart. And so adduction and abduction really are largely responsible for another key parameter in voice, which is the phonation type. And I was watching one of your videos the other day on phonation types, on a range from breathy phonation, which is characterized by very little glottal resistance. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got press phonation, which is a lot of glottal resistance.
And I think I know the video you're referring to, and I actually quote Professor Sundberg in that because he's got that really, really succinct way of saying it. But anyway, please keep going.
So he coined the term, I believe, flow phonation with Goffin back in 1979, and so that kind of falls in the middle of this spectrum, which is, I think he calls it the highest amount of flow, or the highest flow pulse, with full closure of the vocal folds, or Brian Gill would say optimal closure of the vocal folds. Yeah. And So you're really dealing there with less subglottic pressure and less adduction, and it's a really efficient way of using the voice because you
Yeah.
can get quite a boost in energy,
Yeah.
but you get less friction and collision with regards to the vocal fold tissue, which is important because we have to consider not just aesthetic output, getting certain sounds, but minimizing tissue costs so that people can have more stamina and endurance, across a gig, but also longevity with their voice over a lifetime. So things like press phonation, where you're kind of pressing the vocal folds together and there's more of a tissue cost.
Yeah.
No, we have to be careful with that and maybe occasionally use that on mic, as an effect, but try to minimize that because of the tissue cost. And
Yeah.
as you know, every singer is different in what they can handle, the thickness of the protective layer, the mucosa on the vocal folds, etc. And obviously, the level they're at with technique and so on. So we've got to be wise with using things like press phonation.
This is the difficulty I find for many people, for many student singers, is learning or exploring and discovering their own anatomical limits, and recognizing that what I can do is not necessarily what Zac can do, is not necessarily what Beyonce can do, is not necessarily what Ed Sheeran can do. And I think we're so keen to create normative values, and there is there's a ballpark, but within that ballpark, everyone's going to sit at different points, exactly for the anatomical reasons you just outlined.
Amen to that. Yeah, and it is tough. It's tough when people have the pressure of an audition, or they've put in the role and they're being told they need to do it a certain way to come across emotional or to like their character, and there's got to be a balance of patience with regards to the long-term development and being able to make maybe the closest sound you can make to what is required, but with the least tissue costs, so that you don't lose your voice halfway through a run of a show or something like that. Unfortunately, it's a hard thing to teach, that aspect of it. The patience. You can say these things over and over again and find creative ways, but it is a trickier aspect of teaching.
It's hard to teach it, and it's also hard to accept it as the student, to go that I may not have the capacity of the person who I admire or want to be more like, or the role that I want to perform. It's an area, I think, and I'll be interested to hear if there was any discussion around this while you were away. Where in sports, we know that there are certain morphologies that are built for long distance running, marathon, and yet there are certain morphologies that are better built for sprints, and those two extremes do exercise themselves and develop their bodies in keeping with the discipline that they're pursuing, but nonetheless, and we're talking about elite expression of these disciplines, but yet there's almost certainly, if we were to take the elite of the marathon and look at their body shape, and the elite of the sprinters and look at their body shape, almost certainly, if we take it back to the genesis of them wanting to get into those sports, you would never recommend either of them to do the opposite, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's limitations that we have to acknowledge, and it's a tricky balance between not putting someone in a box and say, well, let's figure out what you can do for potential, and let's be patient with the timeline that it takes to do that.
Yes.
And then by the same token saying there's a limit to the thickness of your mucosa, and then also how much hyaluronic acid is present in the vocal folds, both things that will protect the vocal folds from impact forces and collision, So beyond those limitations, then it really is about, within those limitations, optimizing what it is that you do from a physiological standpoint, which again comes back to these things: fine-tuning subglottic pressure, and balancing that with adduction forces, so that you can get the aesthetics that you want or you need, or at least as close to, you know, at least the version that your body can produce sustainably. And you know, again, that a lot of the things factor in too, like amplification, particularly with contemporary singers. It's one of those things that if you're going full out because you listen to a recording and you go, it sounds like they're going for it, and you don't consider the fact that they are singing into a microphone and there's a lot of things that happen in post-production, like that's, you know, you've got to sometimes even just start with that.
Yeah.
That said, I am a fan of helping singers figure these things out without a microphone first,
Yep.
and figuring out physically what feels
Yes.
comfortable,
Yes.
what's sustainable, and then learning to use the mic as an extension of that. But
Yeah. The
yeah,
development of kinesthetic awareness is, well, it's I consider it so important that I start my first lesson with a student is we talk about that. It's so important that we're connected to our instrument physically, and that we really tune into those physical aspects of what we're experiencing as the anatomical instrument.
That's it. That's it. I think I got this from, you know, Dr. Brian Gill, but it was that, you know, particularly in a first voice lesson, if not throughout the journey, it's like we're not just here to develop coordination and to be more expressive, but part of that process is heightening your proprioception. You know,
Yeah.
it's this idea of a proprioceptive
Yep.
barometer, kinesthetic barometer, and
Yeah.
if you have that heightened proprioception, which is what elite singers have,
Yes.
then
Yeah.
you can start to kind of tell when you are pushing too much and there's excess subglottic pressure, and because of that heightened awareness,
Yeah.
you can then, the heightened coordination, start to adjust.
Yeah.
But if you've got a heightened coordination and low proprioception, then it's hard to troubleshoot with regards to knowing when you are giving it too much, etc.
Yeah.
So you've got to develop that awareness
Yeah.
in the process. You know?
And that's harder to develop for some than for others. I think some people are able to really tune in very quickly, very easily to their body and what their body is telling them, and others find it more challenging. But nonetheless, it's something that I think we can all gain from. I want to head up further through the vocal tract. The buzzword of the last decade is resonance.
Yes.
I know this will have been touched on, you know, while you've been away. Let's talk about resonance in relationship to its interplay, because we know that the vocal system is non-linear, that it is not just one way, that there is an interactivity of the whole system. What implication do things like subglottal pressure, adductory force, what sort of impacts are these having on the way our resonance is formed through the vocal tract?
A good question. I think even with just the linear sort of model where we're thinking this way, you know, if we know that an increase in subglottic pressure and adduction can increase the vocal loudness, produce, you know, boost higher harmonics in the spectrum, etc., then but we also know that through resonance, through shaping of the vocal tract, we can also optimize the output of sound. We're wise to figure out how precise we can be as singers or as teachers, guiding our students to have higher resonance awareness so that they can shape the vocal tract to boost as much energy as possible, to get that increase in vocal loudness, so that the hit isn't on the vocal folds with regards to an increase in subglottic pressure. And I think that's a really important thing, is obviously subglottic pressure and contact and closure time of the vocal folds plays a big part in vocal loudness. But if it's the only thing that a singer is using to gain vocal loudness and they're not taking advantage of optimal vocal tract shaping, then one, they're going to be working a lot harder and be prone to things like vocal fatigue. On the other hand, if they do learn to shape their vocal tract in ideal ways, depending on the pitch and the vowel and the context, then they can get a lot more sound output for a lot less effort, which not only feels better, but is more sustainable, and then frees the singer up to focus their attention on being expressive, as opposed to, this hurts, how long until this gig is over, you know? So I think that in a general sense that there's that, but yeah, there is the feedback aspect too, and in the non-linear sense, and it really has to do with finding certain vocal tract shapes that encourage this back pressure or this backward flow of energy that can assist with the vocal
Yeah.
fold vibration
Yeah.
from above. And so things like knowing first resonance or first formant, depending on whose terminology you use, but let's say first formant locations can be really advantageous, particularly in designing exercises. That is that certain cavities within the vocal tract resonate at certain frequencies.
Yeah.
And so if you take advantage of that by creating exercises where singers are singing on those first, which make it not only easier to make more sound, but easier to get the vocal folds to vibrate, then you can encourage these ideal coordinations. Obviously, long term, at a high level, singers need to be able to sing not ideal vowels, depending on what's in the lyric of a song,
Yeah.
without things going haywire down here. But a great place to start is taking advantage of those optimal interactions with regards to which vowels resonate and are easy to sing on certain pitches.
Yeah. That word you've used a number of times now. You acknowledged Brian is using that as well. It's a word I use in my studio a lot, and it is the word of optimal. It's seeking that sense of balance with all of the phonatory points, breath, muscle engagement, flow, adductory force. It's such a challenging thing to refine, isn't it? Because there are so many, even from day to day, the system changes, for any number of reasons.
It does. And that's where I think having tools that can help elicit changes in any of these systems is really helpful, both as a singer and as a teacher, but having tools that elicit changes in these things. So if it is a day like today, I'm getting over a sickness from the last couple of weeks and I've been coughing a lot, so I'm thicker here and I feel it. And so in my warm-ups, I have to, notice that and do certain things to preemptively get the vocal folds to stretch out more, abduct more, because there's more of a tendency to press when you've been coughing a lot. and so those things all factor in. So having tools like lip trills, like raspberries, these things are really important when it comes to being able to get your voice on track for a given type of voice day.
Yeah, absolutely. So resonance, as you highlight, is such an interesting area to workshop and develop, and typically it's the rarity, I think, that a singer stumbles into playing in these areas themselves. Typically it's guided by a singing teacher. An area that a lot of people will, having, if I get a new student come in and maybe they haven't had lessons before, but they've been, as a lot of people do now, they've been doing their own work online, engaging with typically YouTube. An area that also comes up besides the resonance is the hot topic online tends to be registers. We're talking about, head voice and chest voice, which is quite antiquated terminology now. But what interplay have you, do you generally, note around registers and flow and the impact, the interaction between those two? And did you learn anything new about registers while you were away?
That's a good question. I think with regards to what I see in the studio a lot, one of the most common tendencies, let's say beginner student, hasn't had lessons before, comes in and is either doing an exercise or working on a song where there's an ascending interval or a series of ascending intervals. One of the things, and I guess we can tie all of these topics together here, is that there'll be a tendency for a few things to happen, particularly, let's say, if it's a male singer in the middle range and they're ascending in pitch, it could be any voice. One, there's going to be a tendency to increase adduction and subglottal pressure, usually a bit too much, both in the middle range and then as they move up. What often accompanies this is less flow than desired and more subglottic pressure and adduction than required, which means on that phonation type scheme, people tend to get more and more towards press phonation as they start to approach upper range, particularly around transition passaggio area. resonance-wise, that's often accompanied by an ever-increasing mouth opening, particularly on open vowels like ah and ah, which is where most of the climactic notes are, And so a really great strategy, something that was done in a study by Dr. Sundberg, Philippe Allard, and Brian Gill, was it was in male operatic singers, I think it was back in 2013, and they got them to ascend through their passaggio as if they were singing classical. I think these singers also sung other styles, but they did it as if they were, singing classically, and they all made this certain adjustment where, as they ascended on the R vowel, instead of opening the mouth, they started to do some gesture where the mouth closed a little more. So instead of, to be geeky for a second, instead of getting the first resonance of the vocal tract or the first formant to track the second harmonic, which often happens in belting, Donald Miller referred to that as the yell belt strategy, if you know his work. They don't do that. They start to close the mouth, which gets them to move away from that resonance strategy, and then something like the second formant or second resonance will start to tune to like the third harmonic. Was a really common thing they noticed in that study. So they had that comparison, and they got the same singers then to do it as if they were singing musical theater and kind of belting, and then they did the F1 to H2, which is the more common belt strategy. So that's a really important thing. The cool thing to note, and again, Dr. Gill, I've seen him present on this before, but he did it again at this conference in Sandvik, demonstrates that second strategy that is used very frequently by classical tenors and baritones, etc., is also used by a lot of the best pop singers like Ed Sheeran and David Phelps and Brian McKnight and so on. So a lot of these resonance strategies that can help people to negotiate higher parts of the range and can have an influence, we think, on minimizing the pressure and adduction while moving up, can be used across many genres. Obviously, there's other things that factor into singing the genre, like vibrato, etc. But yeah.
And I know for some people listening, they'll be going, "What? What did he just say?"
It's like another language. I'm sorry.
It's completely fine. We've had a number of people. Fortunately, here in the Voice Essentials community, we've had a number of people come on and talk to this subject. It can get very complex, can't it? And do you have a particular book that you would want to direct people to if they wanted to explore this further?
Are we talking about teachers or
resonance and register strategies and those sorts of things?
I would say Ken Bozeman's book is a really good place to start. I started before his book was written and started with Donald Miller's book, which is fantastic. Yes. But it's much more dense, and so I would probably start with Ken's book, and then move to other books like Scott McCoy's book, or Barbara Dosh's book even. Okay. We've learned a lot since then. A lot of the fundamentals in that book are really good too.
Yeah, and I think there's some codifying of terminology too that's starting to. There seems to be a collective of these, researchers starting to decide on the use of certain terminology so that there's not a confusion. It's getting better.
Better, but there's still a divide.
We're not there yet, but it is getting better. I found that when I read Donald Miller's book a long time ago, the terminology used in it, when we compare it to even Ken Bozeman's work, there's a change. But I agree. I think Ken Bozeman, who we've had on the show before, is a really great place to start. Yeah, that's really good. I want to kind of circle back in one sense to bring us, because believe it or not, we're going to have to wrap this up soon, unfortunately. I want to bring it back to breath and what, because okay, in fact, I think I said it again the other day, I think this was on Facebook, where someone was once again presenting this idea of just set and forget the breath, it'll take care of itself. Mm-hmm. And I personally don't come at it from that angle, but you know, every 5 years or so, that kind of flares up again as the way to approach things. What are some of the strategies that we can employ around our breath, given that, you know, we've been talking about subglottal pressure and the sense of the importance of flow and those sorts of things. What are some of the things that what's the takeaway that a singer could take away from our discussion to think, okay, well, I want to really address this area of my breath management?
That's a really good question. I think just knowing that, you know, we got into the technical things that influence subglottic pressure and these things, but I think having tools that can help you to focus on one of those things, and obviously the other parameters are going to change, you know. So one would be a lip trill, you know, using a lip trill to focus on, say, the flow and the air pressure without necessarily having to deal with resistance. So a way you can do that is by doing an unvoiced trill. I like to encourage my students to regulate it with the hands or the fingers.
Yeah.
But essentially, if you're moving the lips and using low flow, you'll see that the lips move in a certain way. And then if I increase the pressure and the flow, because I'm not really resisting here, I kind of got, you know, increased the flow and the pressure and then reduced it again. It's a great way to get acquainted with what does that feel like in my body to drive that increase of flow and pressure. And then as a singer gets maybe a little more control over that, then you can get them to add voice to that once the airflow is moving. So just the gentle thought of I'm going to make a little bit of sound encourages just a little bit of resistance. A lot of singers, when they're first doing this, newer singers will tend to do something like this. And the lips will stop, and very quickly you can then explain, well, why did that stop? Oh, I've run out of air. That's usually the first response. You say, well, I don't think so, because you sighed right after you did it. But usually it's because excess resistance kicked in, it stopped the flow of air, and there was a lot of pressure building up. So we try it again a few times, and you can then start to kind of control and just encourage an ideal amount of resistance that allows the vocal folds to keep vibrating easily and evenly. And the student will know when it feels easy and they're matching the pitch that you're asking them to match, as well as the fact that their lips are vibrating evenly and easily, you'll know, and they will know that they're finding something that is optimal.
Yeah.
Again, something that was reiterated at this course, I think Brian said it, and that is that the easy and even vibration at the lips is reflective of an easy and even vibration at the vocal folds when you're doing the voiced version of that. So you get this really great feedback, particularly if you have them looking in a mirror, where you can then start to learn that. And then you can move from one note to a 5-note scale, or
Yeah.
I often have my singers do, once they start to optimize their trill and find a flow pressure resistance ratio that's easy to sustain, then get them to move through a melody of a song that they're working on. And then, you know, if they can move through a song really easily with regards to that coordination, then they've got a really good chance of being able to carry that over into lyrics. But if it's really difficult on a trill, often they have, with difficult songs, it's going to be trickier to find that consistency with regards to flow pressure ratio across the song.
I think you know, listening to you lay it out like you did just reiterates my contention that these things don't happen naturally for a lot of people. You know, if it were that easy, everyone would be doing it, right? And of course it isn't. And I, like you know, I take people through a process of development, a pathway that, you know, creates experiences for us to be able to make reflective judgments on what our body is doing and how it's doing it, and then being able to put into pattern those things in a practical application, whether it be on an activity or a song. Or thank you for laying that out so eloquently. Very good. I want to finish up because I wonder whether you can just speak to any really notable misconceptions that you hear. Well, we just talked about one, didn't we, about the breath management. What are some other notable misconceptions about voice that you you find yourself having to respond to, or things that you were refined about in your own thinking when you were away at these courses?
Sure. I think one, and it wasn't just at this course, but this really again helped me gain more clarity around this concept. But there's two. Probably one of them was the idea of taking deep breaths. And sometimes when you have a student take a really deep breath, the tendency is to all of a sudden adduct and then sing, and then there's a tremendous amount of pressure. And so I get why some folks say don't take a really deep breath. In light, though, of a lot of the research that Dr. Sundberg has done on tracheal pull, I tend to lean more now towards the idea, and have for some time, but again, this was demonstrated with some of the experiments, to helping people experience taking a larger breath, maybe not topping up fully, but taking a deeper breath. And I guess I should explain tracheal pull. If you think about the trachea, it's your windpipe.
Yeah.
At the top, your trachea is connected to your larynx, and then your trachea connects to your bronchi, bronchiole, lung tissue, etc. So if you take a really deep breath and your diaphragm is further into the body and your ribs expand, those actions are going to stretch your lung tissue. So you get this downward pull on the trachea, the windpipe, through this chain of connections. And that's been shown multiple times, I think, that not only does that then pull the larynx down, but it actually encourages a spreading of the vocal processes. So you get an abductory effect. So obviously a singer could very quickly do that massive breath and then hold their breath. But if they don't do that, or if you can help them to override that tendency, there's a tremendous benefit to starting a phrase with more flow at your disposal to find flow phonation. And what's going to help with that is also just being in a place of more abduction, as opposed to the reverse, which is starting a phrase with a lot of adduction and trying to find the optimal.
The term I often used to express what you've just said is I use the term complete breath. So the idea that and to differentiate between a full breath, being that, if you say, okay, take a big full breath, people overfill, but equally so we don't want that, but we want that sense of complete breath, so that there is a sense of filling. Yeah.
Well said. I think that's what you have to kind of guide a person through, because the worst thing is when they come back the next week and they're like red in the face and they're taking the deepest breath and they're, holding their breath, and, obviously then you've got to reroute.
Yeah.
Generally, the idea of singing, and I'm not doing a good example demoing it, but singing and speaking above what's known as resting expiratory levels. So the idea that if you were to take in a relatively deep breath, and then you started to talk from this place, one, you've got more airflow at your disposal. You've got the benefit of elastic recoil driving some of that pressure. So it's not until about now in the phrase where I'm getting to the point where I'm having to use muscles to continue to drive the flow and pressure.
Yeah.
That's something that a lot of people aren't used to. We in our culture, we tend to, like I'm doing now, speak right here at or below rel, as opposed to learning to speak above rel and taking advantage of that elastic recoil, which can be really a nice feeling. It's a much easier way of getting air out, at least for the first part of a song phrase.
And it's that sense in which we're, in one sense, working with atmospheric pressure too, isn't it? That we're allowing the physics, which is kind of the title of our video today, allowing physics to do the work. Instead of, I often say to students, stop being a human vacuum cleaner. You don't have to suck it in and then push it out. We can work in exactly the way you're talking about, to have this even flow where we're working with the elastic recoil, but also the atmospheric pressure that air wants to equal itself out, doesn't it?
It does, and that's the thing is, think about Boyle's law, which is that, in a soft-walled enclosure, which is our lungs, at a constant temperature, that volume and pressure are inversely related. So if you take in a deep breath, you've got a high lung volume and you've got a low lung pressure, right?
Yeah.
And the body doesn't like that. It wants to equalize those pressures. So it will do some of that work.
Yeah.
And particularly if you're singing at a mezzo forte, a loud dynamic, just letting it out at the beginning as you start to phonate will often be enough. Yeah. Obviously, then if you're singing a pianissimo really quietly after taking a relatively big breath, then it can get a little more complex, and you have to perhaps engage some of your inhalatory muscles to restrain that elastic recoil. But that's a whole other thing. I think starting off, just getting used to what you're talking about, that that reflexive sort of just letting it go, letting it flow, you know.
Letting it go and letting it flow. And that maybe that should be the title of today's video. Let it go and let it flow. Mate, I just want to really appreciate you for joining us today and giving expression to what are really complex subject matters. Like these are not, you know, and I'm very cognizant of the fact that we've scraped the surface of what would have been very, very deep dives into a class with Johann Sundberg, but you've done it in such a lovely and accessible way. So thank you for making the complex less complex.
It's something I continue to endeavor to do for myself, so I have clarity and it can help my students, but also, as I'm sure you do, in communicating these things to students so that they can really take away practical things. I think there's what's the Albert Einstein quote, which is simplify things as much as you need to, but no more than that, you know. And that's always a tricky thing to find the balance, particularly when we're talking about the physics and the and things. It's a tricky balance knowing what's oversimplification and what's helpful simplification.
Yeah, because oversimplification, you know, you can oversimplify things to the point of error, right? And that's the challenge. Yeah, I agree. That's the art of teaching, and that's why, you know, again, besides the fact that we have personal history, it's one of the reasons I wanted to get you on, because your art as a teacher is just so well known, not only here in Brisbane, but you are quite rightly, so respected across the globe by some pretty prominent names, Mr. Bradford. So thank you for coming on, and really appreciated having you on, and we'll do this again. It's likely to be with you being a little bit more weary-eyed because you'll have a new one in there.
You'll hear the cry in the you'll hear some good resonance in the background next time.
That's right. And a baby's resonance, it will cut right through. We'll hear it through brick walls. So
3,000 hertz or so.
Yeah, roundabout. Yeah, that's exactly it. It'll cut through. Mate, thank you for coming on to today's show. Thank you for making yourself available and sharing, you know, your refined information that you were able to glean as you travelled around, and we as a community here at Voice Essentials, we just feel so privileged to have you share that with us. So thanks again.
Thanks for having me. It was my absolute pleasure, and I'll keep up the great work. I love watching the interviews you do and the episodes you put out. So thank you for your contribution to the field, Dan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. It's made all the easier when I get wonderful guests on the show like yourself. So I just have to sit back and ask a few, you know, half interesting questions and let people like you go for it. So it's fantastic. Thank you again.
My pleasure.
What can we say? I mean, we just have the most amazing people on the show, and Zac, you know, he kind of sells himself a little bit short of. I mean, he is so good at what he does, highly respected here in Brisbane, but also highly respected across the globe by some really big names in the area of voice and voice science, and I consider it a real privilege to know Zac and to have that history that I have with him, and we'll have him on the show again, no doubt. He might be a little bit more bleary-eyed next time we see him, but that'll be a wonderful thing. I hope you've enjoyed today's live hangout. Next week we have here in Brisbane we have what's called the King's Birthday public holiday. So we don't get to hang out again next week. So it'll be in 2 weeks' time that you and I will be hanging out again for a Q&A, and I'm very much looking forward to doing that with you. We will have Professor Brian Gill, who Zac kept mentioning, and who has been on the show many times now. Brian will be joining us again, I think it's sort of mid-November-ish. So make sure you subscribe, hit the white bell icon, because I don't want you to miss that show. I don't want you to miss any shows. And so please, if you haven't already, subscribe and join this ever-growing community of singers from across the globe who, you know, we dig a bit deeper here at Voice Essentials. We're not content for, you know, just loud and proud singing, although that has its place. We really want to understand. You know, there's a little saying that I've said many times here on the show: when you know more, you can sing more. And it's a real key point. It's something that we live by here. We sing by here at Voice Essentials. And we're going to keep doing that for the rest of this year and beyond. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks for a Q&A. I look forward to seeing you then. I'm Dr. Dan. Sing well.